Hello everybody and welcome to the Arboricultural Association headquarters here in Stonehouse in the UK. I'm John Parker, Technical Director of the Association, and I'm delighted that you're able to join us this evening for the third and final part in our lecture series, An Ecosystem Approach to Urban Forestry with Rob Northrop and Michael Andreu. As ever, please use the chat to tell us where you're watching from. I can see a few of you doing that already. And to resume the great discussion which we've been having for the last few weeks. Just remember to address your comments to all panelists and attendees and to use the Q&A box for specific questions. And I'll be going through as many as I can at the end of the presentation, and apologies in advance if I don't manage to get through them all. Any moment now, I'll be handing you over to Rob and Michael. But first of all, I wanted to let you know part of the plan for the next few weeks. Next week, we will not be holding a webinar. Dun, dun, dun. What are we going to do? This is our 17th in 16 weeks, so we thought we'd take a bit of a break for most of September while we prepare for all of the autumn events. So you can use next week to catch up on any of the recordings that you might have missed. The following Wednesday, September the 9th, we're going to be hosting an extra special webinar, which I'd very much like to invite you to. Every week you've heard me mentioning the fact that the association is based here in Stonehouse, and I've been asked by the Stonehouse History Group to give a talk about the importance of the trees in our town. So after weeks of chairing, I finally get to actually give a presentation myself. And if none of you sign up to watch, then I will be very, very upset. I will be taking names. I actually have lists of names, so please come and watch. You can register free for that one on our website now. And please note that will be held at the later time of 7:30 on September the 9th. And then the other bit of exciting news is that the association is going to be holding a series of webinars in the week of October the 5th for our Tree Health Week to reflect the fact that 2020 is the UN International Year of Plant Health. We're going to have a webinar every night of that week, and the full program of events will be launched in the coming weeks for you to register. So, and there might be a few extra bits as well in September. We like to keep busy, so keep an eye out for all of that on our website. So, more than enough from me. I'm going to try and make sure I can fix my computer now so that we can actually operate the chat. But to buy me some time to do that, it's my very great pleasure for the last time in this series to introduce Rob and Michael for the finale to Guess That Cone. I mean, to an ecosystem approach to urban forestry. Rob, Michael, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, John. First, we want to thank the Arboricultural Association for the brilliant job that they're doing with these webinars in bringing us all together from different parts of the world to share what we've learned as we begin to practice and create this emerging new discipline of urban forestry. And we also want to thank them for inviting us to be part of that. Michael and I have been working at this for many, many years, together 15 years and longer before that. And we believe that the greatest thing that we can do is to give away what we learn and to collaborate and to talk with other people, to share. And so this gives us that great opportunity, and we are very, very appreciative of that. The other thing I want to say is that Michael and I will use the word we often. And when we say we, there are many people behind this, what we talk about. It's not just Michael and myself. It's a brilliant and retired, what we might call municipal arborist, who became the supervisor of natural resources for the City of Tampa, Kathy Beck, an absolutely courageous person who took many chances and who was open to new ideas. Also Ross Dickerson, who's now the director of the lands within Hillsborough County that surround the city of Tampa, 32,000 hectares of rare, threatened, and endangered species habitat. Another courageous person who believes that incorporating science and integrating the social context into work leads to more sustainable outcomes and more sustainable programs. And of course, we would be remiss not to mention one of our longtime collaborators, Sean Landry, an absolutely brilliant geographer and a wizard with ArcGIS. He's a professor at the University of South Florida. My longtime friend, goes back many decades now, Wayne Zippra, a research scientist, forester from the U.S. Forest Service, and our latest colleague and the youngest is a research arborist, Andrew Kozer, who you have met before on some of these webinars. So when we say we, please understand that we mean that we, and there's many, many more I couldn't possibly list at that point. What I want to do right now, I'm going to start the program off. I'm going to share the screen with you. And so I'm going to turn it over to Michael. Michael, please introduce yourself, and then we'll turn and get the program going.
Okay, great. Well, thanks again, everybody. You know, thank you, Rob, for saying all the things that you said, because I don't have to say them now. But we really do sincerely appreciate this opportunity to be here with all of you, and again, that emphasis on this team effort that's associated with all that we're talking about. My name is Michael Andreu. I'm an associate professor at the University of Florida at the School of Forest Resources and Conservation, and I work in the area of forest systems. So prior to coming to the university, I worked for years as a forest manager. And so just sort of want to make sure everybody understands those are the two lenses that I approach this topic on ecosystems approach to urban forestry. And so I come from both a management and an academic background. So first thing I want to do is briefly recap or sort of give you the previously on version of what we've talked about in our first two webinars. And just go over that so that those of you, especially that maybe weren't participating in those, will sort of have a sense of what we're talking about here. In our first webinar, we presented to you a case study of a place where our team, Rob and I, and all those other people, as well as others, had been involved with since really starting about 2005. And we told you a story about that, about the Tampa Bay watershed. That was the focus of our discussion. And we told the story about an urban forestry program or set of programs, and the idea of urban forestry really shifting from being perceived as, programs that were sinks for financial resources. A lot of times, not just in Tampa, but all over the world, we see these urban forestry programs are often perceived as just, we'll fund them when we funded everything else, and whatever's left over, that's where we'll put the last bits of money. And really, it's just, boy, it's even maybe not always put there happily. It's sort of an expense that we have to put up with. And that's a common perception. That was certainly, not uncommon for this area as well. It was also sort of an area where a lot of regulation and policies were perceived by some as being arbitrary and not based on any factual foundations. And so there were segments of the society out there that sort of saw them as barriers to development and advancement. At the same time, on the other end of the spectrum, you'd hear that the urban forestry programs were not really effective tools for conservation, and they weren't working well. So there's all this conflict going on, a lot of stagnation. So that was the beginnings of the story. And as we worked through the story, we brought you to the end of the story, to this area being a place where urban forestry had been elevated within the government, and had been now, perceived as being an asset. The urban forests were perceived as assets versus sort of these things that they had to deal with. And urban forestry programs were really integrated into the management of the broader political infrastructure there, the bureaucratic infrastructure there. We saw that the policies and the regulations were being developed and based on science. And the perception was that these policies were now making more sense because they had been, founded on these scientific principles. And that was a really big step forward. And finally, that we saw that conservation effectiveness was something that could be quantified and could be articulated and demonstrated. And so a really neat sort of movement and shift in the years that we sort of told you the story of the Tampa Bay watershed. And this was happening not just in one city, but this was also happening at various scales, including the broader, within the city of Tampa, but also the broader Hillsborough County regional area. So we're sort of trying to give that. So that was the first webinar, sort of this case study or set of case studies that we gave. In the second webinar, we then attempted to provide you with some of the theory behind how that all happened there. Because that, the question is, well, how do you do that? How does something like that, how do you see that kind of transformation happen? And so we brought that theory out and that we used in our approach to the Tampa Bay watershed. One of the things we first discussed was the importance of collaboration, certainly. But we also then began to talk about the value and importance of collecting data about the urban forest, and how that was one of our very first steps, was to really begin to get information, gather it, and bring it together in one place, and how important that data is for communicating the status of the forest, being able to communicate the structure, the composition, and the functionality associated with that forest. And we discussed how this data can be used in models to calculate both the services or the values produced by these forests and the disservices associated with them. And again, moving us from simply having conversations that are a lot of hand waving about the forest to becoming a debate based on information defined scientifically. So that was sort of the second part of this. And in that case, we were really talking about the biophysical forest and focusing on the biophysical landscape. But that's not all. And so as we were moving through this process, we talked about also that there was a shared, we shared with you the idea that urban forest management and conservation is primarily a social endeavor. And so to that end, we discussed the importance of being able to describe the social landscape, not just that biophysical landscape, and the importance of collecting data about the human constituencies that are living and using the urban forest. And so what you may have heard from us was that, well, collecting data is important, and certainly it is important, but that's not a new message. Academics and scientists, we always say that. We always say you need data, you need information. So that's what we've done in these first two webinars. And now it's like, well, what are we going to do today? Well, today we want to build a bridge from that science-based, approach that we just described to management. We want to try to find that bridge and describe how we bridge that gap. Because so often, as managers, we get a bunch of data, we collect this data, but we don't know what to do with it and how to move from having all this data to using data to inform actions, all right? And to see that not just that it helps us tell us what actions we might want to take, but that data can be used to not only to inform what we need to do, but also to inform the effectiveness, and understand how effective we are in doing those actions. So that's what we really want to do, is today try to move in that direction. And we hope to walk you through a process, a framework, an approach, whatever you want to call it, that we've used, that we've developed, and in the case of Tampa, but also that we're using with other cities and urban areas around the state and hopefully in other parts of the country. And so that's what we're going to share with you today, is this really sort of this approach, and we hope that it has a very practical aspect to it, and that you can see how science and management really begin to merge together.
So what we want to begin to do is to give you a very practical and approachable mechanism for developing urban forest plans that are strategic, that are systematic, and that we believe lead to some sustainability. So the first thing we recognize is that when you begin to approach the development of a strategic urban forest plan, that you have to begin a dialogue, to begin the conversation. You've been hired, or in many cases, you've been directed by a government agency to develop an urban forest management plan. And you have to begin the conversation clearly defining what it is that you're intended to have as outcomes. In other words, what's the purpose of the plan? And because it is an ecosystem-based approach, and because we take systems very seriously, we have to get away from looking at the symptoms of problems and getting to the place where we can actually recognize what the true causes of the symptoms are. What are the real problems? We have to begin to what psychologists would like to call critical thinking. And that is getting down to the heart of the problem. You have to do this right away, because what we're going to show you right now is not simple, but you have to recognize that what you're trying to do is brand new, and it's not simple. Since the late 1890s, the engineering professions, after their magnificent job of sanitizing the city, have led us to a place where we have engineered cities. Today, we're now recognizing that we have to bring back all of these other parts of the natural world into our cities, but not only that, but that the city is now expanding and affecting the native forest outside of its political boundaries. So remember that when Michael and I talk about the urban forest, we're talking about entire metropolitan regions, not just the urban core. Okay, so it's important to recognize what it is that you're trying to do. All right, then we got a little thing going here. So also to begin the conversation, again, just clarifying everything, clearly stating the philosophy that we're going to follow. And this is what Michael and I would say, let's say when we did our last work with Gainesville in Florida. We went in and we said, we can help you develop a sustainable urban forestry program by using an ecosystem-based management approach, which we explained and documented. That the purpose of the urban forest management plan was to support and be an integral part of urban sustainability. That the plan itself, when they got it, would be outcome-based so that they could evaluate it and test it to see that they were getting what they wanted to get. That it was performance-based management, again, that they could monitor each incremental step as they tried to get to their key objectives, to their ultimate desired outcome. And that we were going to help them use strategic planning systems. We were not going to look at one little part of the urban forest or one little symptom of the problem, but to help them create an entire system so that the urban forest then became integral with all the other aspects of their public policy, land use, and activities within the city, not something separate. Here's an image.
Hey, Rob, let me just say
Yes.
something real quick. Can you go back one slide, please? I think that's it's important to remember too, is that this is a really important step in the process, is to make sure that this is said at the beginning and it's said repeatedly throughout the process to remind people of what it is, how we're going about doing this, because a lot of times people want to bypass some of these steps and sort of just get to the end, and you really have to remind people that this is the philosophical underlying of everything we're doing through this process.
Yeah, thanks, Michael. That's a good point. And also, I guess I didn't mention that part of this philosophy is that the process that we're going to show you, and this we need to state this up front to the people that we're working with, is that the plan development will be inclusive. That is, we will not just take expert advice from one group or another. It's to be an urban strategy for forest management includes everyone. It'll be incremental. That is, we'll use critical thinking every single step of the way. We won't jump to conclusions, and it will be deliberative. And that means that every step along the way in the process of creating this strategic plan will be discussed and will be debated. The other part to keep in mind that Michael and I always tell people is that we will act as knowledgeable facilitators and moderators. These are not our cities, and we will not tell you or everyone what it is that you need to do. This is the structure of how the plan might look. I'm just going to show you this right now. It looks a bit complicated, and perhaps it is a bit complicated, but it's indicating that there's a collaborative approach between the public and the city staff. You can see a good bit of the plan, as represented here, is truly social, that there is a place for science and technology that is significant, but that science and technology are the tools that the social values of the people, of all the people, in and outside of government, use to etch out their vision of what the urban forest is on the urban landscape. We'll get back to this image in just a bit, but I wanted to give you this just to show it to you so that it doesn't pop up someplace and be difficult to understand. We're going to go through these things step by step. As Michael has mentioned before, and will mention over and over again, and I always kid people, but it's true, don't do this alone. This is a big process. Remember that you're attempting to create an urban forest program that is sustainable, sustainable not only from the standpoint of a budget, but that it has a voice in government. It has a seat at the table. That was one of the things Kathy Beck told us in the city of Tampa when we were done. She told me that finally she had a seat at the table. That when big plans were made for transportation, for building, for land use change, the plan itself now assured that she would be sitting right at the table with the engineers, with the director of the planning department, and with the legislative representatives also. One of the things to keep in mind about for us as foresters, as managers, as arborists, as planners, but particularly the folks of us who are foresters and arborists, is that the work that we need to do, unless you want to remain a technical arborist or a technical forester, is going to require that you get out of that technical realm of dealing with the tree or with the forest itself directly and begin to engage in public policy. Something a lot of us don't want to do. Collaboration, people, the institutions, and science. A scientifically grounded management program is necessary to maximize the value and minimize the risk associated with trees in this complex and dynamic human ecological system. The ecosystem approach to management of the urban forest requires cooperation, not only city agencies, but neighborhoods and individual residents. So we mentioned that conservation, urban forest conservation and management, is primarily a social endeavor. It is the values of the people who live in the city or in the metropolitan region who ultimately determine what the political body looks like. In our country, we have elections, and so those values are played out directly into the political body. And the political body represents those values. They do not represent technology and science. They represent the values of the people. So the first thing you do, if you're someplace new, or maybe you're not someplace new, maybe it's someplace you've been for a while, but you've not thought about actually looking at this. You've just kind of gone on a gut reaction. Well, you know the people. Well, how about you stop back and you begin to review readily available information like on demographics from census reports, the history of the area, the land use characteristics and how they're changing over the last 20 or 30 years as we've had this rapid explosion of human population. These can give you readily available information that is important about incomes and levels of education, backgrounds in terms of different cultures, and what those cultures might perceive or not perceive in terms of whether they like trees and forests in their urban areas. If this isn't enough, and Michael and I don't think it's enough most of the time, to conduct broad social surveys to assess citizen values across the broad urban landscape, but use science-based published surveys to guide in the organization and the specific forms of the questions that you need to ask. It's out there. Just look at what other people have done, but think of it as science. Look at what other people have done and see whether it's been published and whether social scientists agree that that was a reasonable way to get at and express those values. If what you're doing has to be done at a smaller scale, perhaps not the city, but perhaps into a planning district or into a neighborhood, consider using focus groups. Again, I would encourage you to use social scientists to run small groups where you actually ask them specific questions. These are called focus groups, or nominal group sessions, which are a little bigger and a little bit more less specific in terms of what we're asking them, so that we can get the people to participate in surveys who don't typically participate in these broader surveys. And we need to go to them on their time schedule. I'll give you a for instance. When you have 2 jobs, you don't have time to sit around and fill out forms that come across the computer. When you have 2 jobs, and maybe even your partner has a job too, and you have children, you don't have time or money perhaps to be able to go to public meetings. You're so involved with surviving that you don't have that opportunity. If you look at like census data and you recognize that you have communities that are in that type of economic situation, these are great places to go specifically and run focus groups and to gather that type of information so that you are in fact using that first pillar of being inclusive and making sure that you're getting and hearing from everyone. The work that Michael and I have done in all 3 of the case studies that we're showing you, unfortunately did not begin with the social surveys. But because we recognized that the social information was so important, that just at the immediate time when we were asked to do these biophysical inventories and analyses, Michael and I began to gather that social information ourselves. And I can tell you that in both cases, with the cities that we work with and with the larger landscape conservation of rare, threatened, and endangered species, it was not recognized immediately by the government agencies or the government in general that where you needed to start with was the social engagement. But this is an example from Tampa, and most of you will recognize this. This was actually called U4 back when we did it, but it's now called iTree Eco. And we took very standardized methodology and analysis procedures, and we began to look at this city using iTree outcomes. And that you'll see as all the blue dots or the green dots showing up on your screen within that yellowed area. That's the boundary of Tampa. What you're seeing, the red boundaries with all the slightly different muted colors are the sub-watersheds that all flow in and through Tampa. In other words, Tampa is connected to these sub-watersheds by hydrology, a major form of connectivity within the landscape. And so that the city of Tampa is embedded in this other ecosystem defined by watersheds. So what we did, we then put about 300 more plots outside of Tampa so that they could be measured too over time, because we wanted to see how the city affected what was outside. We wanted to see how what was going on just outside the city was affecting the city. But also we wanted to begin to see how the area on the right-hand side of your screen was being affected by urbanization. How was the forest changing? Was the composition changing? Was the distribution of the forest changing, right? Was the structure of the forest changing? Were the outcomes of the forest, like hydrology, was that changing? Was its effect on air quality changing? Was its effect on human health changing? Trying to place the city of Tampa within an ecological context and not just a municipal context. So at this point then, in all these three cases, we would have finished some of the biophysical analyses, looked at ecological relationships of the biophysical analyses that we could pull out. We would have done some of the social surveys, perhaps not getting to the fine scale ones of focus groups, but certainly the social surveys, looking at census data and looking at land use patterns over time. The first thing we do, public meeting. Get it out. Start to tell everybody that you're working for. This is what we're finding. Begin to encourage the conversation about conservation. And this conversation is the most important thing I think that we can do, is to cause this conversation to begin and then to facilitate it so it never ends. Because conservation itself is an unending dialogue between society and the biophysical world, including all of the biological elements in our world. Communication. Tell your story. Communication. Listen to their stories. Don't stop. Don't ever miss an opportunity to have a meeting. If you're invited, I went to every single meeting every time anybody ever invited me. Sometimes there were 5 people, sometimes there were 500 people. Sometimes there were just 2 people. Matter of fact, there was one I went to where there was only 1 person. Once you begin to do this, and by the way, when you begin to have these public meetings, who else shows up but the media? And the media begins to get interested. Why are these meetings happening? Tell the story. Tell the story of what you're doing. Tell it. Make sure that they understand that philosophy. It's inclusive, right? It's iterative. It's deliberative. I'm not telling you what to do. I'm here as the facilitator. I know a bunch about urban forest ecology, but I'm not going to tell you how to manage your city. I'm going to be an intelligent moderator. And stay there and don't ever leave it. Michael?
Yeah, I think the telling the story part is really important. Again, here it's to emphasize, and that means you're telling the story based on the data that's been collected, the information that you have in front of you, and then you formulate it into maps, you formulate it into services, etc. But you can start to talk to people about the forest and the social landscape that it exists within. And by doing so, it's really interesting, because in many cases you'll find that people are not used to hearing about the forest and that social landscape in this manner. And what it does, it's I don't know how many of you all remember when GIS first came out, but GIS, I remember when as a tool was just that mapping tool. It made nice maps, and we just thought it was neat for that reason. But as we began to use GIS more and more, we realized that there was all kinds of cool questions that could be asked that we had never been able to ask prior to having this tool. we couldn't ask it as easily. We just didn't even think that way because those spatial kinds of questions were not something that were available to be asked. And so now, you know, landscape ecology and all of these things, they're doing all kinds of amazing things utilizing GIS. And it's the same thing with this kind of data. When all of a sudden people are presented with it and told how, you know, what's out there and how it looks and that there's information about it, they start to ask a whole suite of different questions than they had before. And they didn't realize they could ask those kinds of questions. And that kind of excitement and generated by the public, it gets back to the bureaucracy. It gets back to the political leadership, and they get it. They get it that people are beginning to value and recognize the value of this urban forest. So I think that's really important.
Yeah, and Michael, I think also what's important is that this very rarely happens, that the people begin to recognize that they're truly being encouraged to become co-collaborators in the development of government policy. So often government policy is done by the experts, right? And if you get a chance to talk about it, you show up at a public meeting and you get 2 minutes to say something. This is the development of public policy in which the citizenry is engaged from the very beginning. Nothing has even been written on a piece of paper yet, and we're already beginning to share the stories, listen to their stories, and engage them. So the second thing then is if you're beginning to be able to at least sketch out a storyline, you now recognize who the people are who live in your city from these surveys, from these government documents, by carrying on public meetings and carrying on little nominal group sessions, breaking them out into groups, taking notes as you saw our good friend over here doing at this session. I mean, this is what we did. We have these meetings, but then we don't just do that and talk to them. We break them out into small groups like you're seeing over on the right-hand side of your screen, right? And we're taking notes, and they're seeing that we're taking notes from them. That's exciting. Once we have that, we can then go back to the political body, and we ask them, now we begin to engage the political body in the process directly, okay? Because we've taken all the social data, they've seen that, and we say, okay, so now what we need is for you to identify a smaller group that represents the diversity of opinions, diversity of cultures, diversity of economic interests within your city, so that they can begin to develop the goals, the vision for the future for the urban forest, the goals, and some of the guiding principles. We're going to talk about these. This is the first step in actually laying out what will become the physical plan. The vision itself is an expression of the future desired condition. What is it that the urban forest needs to be? Okay, again, Michael and I, we have our opinions, but our opinions don't count here. What we are here to help them do is to understand that we're looking for a vision, okay, their vision. And we work with them until they craft it. The same thing for the goals. These are broad goals. I'm going to show you some examples in just a second. So the broad goals, they're not objectives, they're not specifics, they're the bigger pieces. They're the bigger pieces that they express about what the city needs to be focusing on in the long term. The guiding principles that they develop are the guiding principles, in this case, for the government. The government can only do so much, right? The government can only do so much. It has limits. It can't do everything, at least not where we live, okay? It's not totalitarian. It can't tell everybody exactly what to do. It can basically serve the purpose of being a focal point for social discussion, discourse, and agreement or disagreement. And it also, because it's in an urban landscape where there is much more public control of open space and land and rights of way, they do actually control a good bit of the urban landscape. So this is the public committee. This public committee will never dissolve. And I'll show you that at the end of this program. This public committee will be with us forever, if it works right, because this public committee becomes the encapsulation of the values of the citizens. So here we wanted to show you, we won't do this to you very often, put a bunch of words on the screen, as you know, but read it over real quick. These are two different vision statements from two different cities within Florida that we worked with. The one on the right comes from Tampa, and you can see it's much bigger, obviously, much more wordy. They had a lot they wanted to get in there. But there are some pretty significant differences between the two. Tampa immediately wanted to talk about that there were benefits, that they wanted to maintain and expand the benefits. They were, I think Tampa's was much more focused on human benefits and human perspectives, enhancing quality of life for present and future citizens, numerous economic and ecological benefits. But an interesting part was that they wanted to ensure that there were opportunities to better understand their natural environment through scientific research and public education. They said this very, very specifically. They wanted the science to drive. They wanted the science to help clarify, not drive, to help clarify the conversation. Gainesville, on the other hand, gave us a very succinct future desired condition. Gainesville's urban forest is abundant, diverse, healthy, and benefits the community. Says a lot of the things, but different. But you'll notice that Michael and I did both of these things, used the same process, and that the vision statements came out relatively different. And I wanted to show that to you to, again, remind you that Michael and I were not trying to tell people what it is that they wanted or what the future of their city or their urban forest would be. Michael?
Yeah, just to point out too, that in both cases, regardless of how they stated it, there is a biophysical landscape component and there is a social landscape component included. And
right.
So, and that's important again, so to emphasize that it has to, these vision statements, while we don't tell them what to put, we want to make sure that they include those both elements.
We wanted to show you, these are the goals that came out of those two cities. Pretty different. But in the end, they're all heading in that same direction of urban forest sustainability and the benefit to citizens, to efficiency and effectiveness. It's a lot. I'm sorry to have put this much up there, but if you look at the ones that are highlighted, the ones on the left are from Gainesville. The urban forest should predominantly reflect the diversity of the surrounding native forest. Gainesville, by the way, was the species mix of trees and shrubs within the city was overwhelmingly native. In other words, it already reflected the native forest that surrounded the city, and the Public Committee on Urban Forest Sustainability thought that it should be kept that way because it gave the city a unique character. But you can see number 7, they got right back down to the urban forest should support Gainesville's community's values and unique character. This goes down to that granularity that somebody mentioned during our first webinar. They asked, well, how do you deal with neighborhoods? And here was the very beginning of the organization of this plan, already indicating that the plan itself had to get down to those neighborhoods because there were unique characteristics in those neighborhoods, there were unique histories, there were unique landscape forms, and there were unique cultures in there also. I want to point out on the right-hand side from the city of Tampa, the need to communicate and maintain and protect the complexity of natural systems, and to support rich and diverse habitat. They were very concerned about maintaining the biological diversity that was still within the city, and to understand that the city had a role in the maintenance of biological diversity and ecological function. Also, if you'll notice, they use the words in number 4 to create inclusive, there's that inclusivity again, partnerships that encourage collaboration among all affected parties. So they wanted this to be a truly collaborative effort. They did not want this to be taken off by a group of experts to be packaged and then presented. They wanted this process to continue.
One other thing I just want to point out, Rob. Number 6 on the Gainesville side, on the left-hand side there, the urban forest should bring beauty, interest, and a calming atmosphere to the urban environment. You remember how tough that one was to sort of develop and work through that wording on that, and that idea of beauty. That was really an interesting set of conversations. And how will we define it? How will we work with that? But that was a really important idea that the committee had, and they insisted and wanted to make sure that was included in this goals.
That's right. And so later on, we won't show you that part of it, but later on, as we work through that, we actually had objectives that dealt with visual access to nature and physical access to nature to incorporate that. And that goal is very difficult because it's very difficult to define beauty. But everyone on all of these goals that you see, all of this and the vision that you see, okay, those were all solidified through consensus. So that when these public committees were done, nobody had anything to say about these. They were satisfied that they had worked through it to the point that these were all valuable and should be recognized within the planning process and dealt with directly. Yes, Paul.
And so one of the things that Rob and I do, he's shown you that triangle and how we're working through that triangle. And so the vision is at the top of the triangle and these goals are down there next. And we often argue about that triangle. We agree on the words and that triangle, but one of the things I think is important to keep in mind is that what we've just shown you, that vision statement that is created and these goals, they really are fundamental and foundational to the rest of the process. And so for me, I always argue that triangle needs to be flipped over, that ought to be at the bottom and not the top. And I know that's a silly thing, but these two parts right here are incredibly important and will be revisited repeatedly throughout the rest of this process.
Right.
And so how they're derived and how they're agreed upon through consensus, like Rob just described, that's important to understand because it establishes the credibility of the rest of the plan.
That's right, Michael. And I'm glad that you mentioned that. These vision statements and these goals, they will never be violated in the development of this plan. Nothing in this plan can violate the vision and the goals. And we're going to see how we ensure that. And remember that this public committee, when they work to create that vision and those goals, they are using the social surveys that we have connected to. They are using the biophysical information, and they are being guided by the citizenry in general. So always important to understand this vision and these goals will never be violated, ever. Don't forget the political body. When you get the vision and the goals, when you get this social information together, okay, go to them, show them. Your efforts to gather and understand what the citizens' values are will now be greatly appreciated. Your elevation, their respect for you will change instantly because now you are willing to have their conversation, and their conversation is about values. and how they take care of the people and the things that the people value. The other thing that I have over here too on the left, this by the way is from Tampa. This is the city council and the mayor on the left, Bob Buckhorn, who we worked with for 8 years. Whenever you can, you should go meet these people individually. It doesn't have to be public meetings, okay? That's very helpful to create a personal relationship. Not a relationship like buddies and friends or anything, but that you're recognized as a person who cares about the values of the people in the city while you're working through this project of developing a sustainable urban forestry program. When I first met Bob Buckhorn, he had 10 minutes. That's all he could give me. Obviously, pretty big city, very busy guy, right? He sat down, we sat down, just he and I. He said, Rob, he said, I don't even know the name of any tree at all. Not a single tree do I know the name of. And I said, Bob, I said, you don't have to. I said, what you really need to understand is at the urban forests reduces the symptoms of attention deficit disorder in your children, that it raises the self-esteem of young teenage women, okay? That it reduces violent crime, that it reduces domestic violence, that it builds social cohesiveness in your communities. And you know what? Bob Buckhorn always talked to me after that because I was talking his conversation. That's what he knew. And that's what he cared about. And I told him, Bob, I said, what I'll do is, I said, you know, I know you're busy. You'll get to read it. Maybe you won't, but I'm gonna send you some of the science. I said, I'll put it together. You know, I'll annotate it and give you the science that shows you that these things that I said, that these are true, that these are based upon science. I began to have the conversation of values with the part of the government that works in the system of values. And it worked. The other thing to remember is that the political body and the executive, in this case the mayor, are the ones who tell the bureaucracy what to do. So that leads us to our next step, is if we're going to be inclusive and iterative and deliberative, we have got to bring the bureaucracy into this conversation. And that means everybody. Okay, that means public works, transportation, wastewater, planning, parks and recreation, stability, sustainability, regional utilities, solid waste, you know, code enforcement, human services, the police, the fire department, economic development department. We are looking to integrate the urban forest into the processes and the outcomes of the government. Not to create a separate little program, not to spin off by itself, because it fails when it does that, as we've seen in our own experience. We are looking to integrate it. So the Technical Advisory Committee, and you look at that triangle now on the left-hand side of your screen at the bottom, and you'll see the vision and the goals and the guiding principles are coming to them from the Public Committee on Urban Forest Sustainability. The internal technical advisory committee cannot change that. That is not their job. Their job is to be technical experts. How do you accomplish the vision, the goals within the context of those guiding principles? How do you do that? That's their job. Not to determine what the values are of the citizenry, not to change the vision and the goals, but to work for the citizens. So their job now is to take those broad ideas and to break them down into chunks in which they can look at and understand the present condition of the urban forest and how they might fashion different objectives and steps to achieving that desired future condition that we see in the vision. Michael?
Just want to add one thing here about how do you get all those people at the table, and why, you know, because that's a long list of people that you listed off that need to be there. You know, you said police, you said, you know, the waterworks people, code enforcement. I mean, and a lot of those people don't necessarily even see themselves as being part of urban forest management. And so this can often be a real hindrance. Is if you want this to be integrated throughout the bureaucracy, you got to get all the heads of these departments or their person that they've designated to be there to actually come to the table. And that is not going to readily happen unless you've got that political backing. So again, that step before bringing this information to the political body, to the council, to the mayor, and getting them to understand those values of the people that they've already been expressed. When they see that, they're going to then, tell that bureaucratic portion of the government that they need to come to this conversation, that they need to be part of this.
And that's right, Michael. And I just in terms of telling the story, I told you about the first time that I met with the mayor of Tampa, Bob Buckhorn. The last thing that Bob said to me when he shook my hand was he said, "This is good. Just tell me what you need and I'll get it for you." That's how you get the department heads together. The political body has to direct them. The people that appoint them to their jobs has to direct them to do it. Okay? The directors of departments, in all fairness, are also very, very busy, have immediate concerns. They are constantly, as we have been in the past, reacting to trying to adjust and fix things as things break down. So big processes going on. Getting them together requires the political body to instruct them to do that. I'm going to move right now through a little bit of this because we don't want to take too much of your time. I want to remind you all, though, that Michael and I are here to share what we've learned and to collaborate. And we would love nothing more than to continue to share and collaborate with you after this presentation is done, not just in the Q&A, but in the future. You get the technical advisory committee together, they begin to sketch out what they believe needs to be done to meet the vision and the goals that are set by the community. Don't forget these folks. Go back and tell them, keep telling them and showing them what the Internal Technical Advisory Committee did. Keep them in the conversation. Keep the directors and the bureaucracy in the conversation. Keep the neighborhoods in the conversation and keep the professional people in the conversation. It takes a lot of energy to do this, but you are looking to transform the very image and vision of the modern city from one that is engineered to one that incorporates the living world back into it. That, my friends, is a really big step. You can do it. So we're back to this sketch again. You'll see now, the vision and the goals and the guiding principles were developed by the public committee, and that reflected, as we can see on the side, the social input that we had from the big surveys, from the census, from all the data we can gather, and perhaps from some neighborhood meetings now we're getting that. And that once we get down to the technical part, that is setting objectives and setting up a plan for the government to function, that becomes the purview of the Internal Technical Advisory Committee, because that is their job about how to technically make the government function to achieve agreed upon goals. Also, one of the things I want to get you to recognize at this point particularly is the integrated nature and the consistent nature of this process. Even when the public committee went from their original vision to their goals, they had to go back every time and look at the vision. And we asked them, is this goal consistent with the vision? Is it consistent? Okay, and they would work through wording sometimes and change the goal so that it was consistent with the vision. When the Internal Technical Advisory Committee gets down to identifying objectives for the urban forestry program, each objective went all the way back to the vision to ensure that it was not in conflict with the vision, it was not in conflict with the goals, it was not in conflict with the guiding principles. And that was done by taking those objectives and sending them back to the public committee and having them look at it and saying, do you see any inconsistencies here with what the bureaucracy is doing? Later, I'm going to show you some things about these performance indicators and the actions, but every step along the way, every step was sent back to the public committee, back to the political body. Is it inconsistent at all with the vision, the goals, and the guiding principles? So we want to look, just for instance, at one goal. This comes out of the city of Gainesville. Citizens in their government should be educated about the urban forest and its benefit. You notice they said citizens and their government. So how do we begin to address that in the plan itself? Well, we say, okay, well, that goal can be represented as one of the elements in the plan. City government agencies and the commission. That's what we're going to look at right now, because there's actually another element that deals with public education and even gets broken down more. It gets down to public education for landowners, public education for children. So you can see that there are different elements that come out of the goals. The goals are very broad. In this case, we're dealing strictly with city government agencies and the commission. That's the political body. You notice that the first thing we do in parentheses under that element is we identify the goal it's attached to and the part of the goal it's attached to. So we're connecting these things, okay? The Internal Technical Advisory Committee then develops the objective. I'm not sure I can pull that objective down. Departments including GRU, which is the regional utilities people, and city commission are provided support and training on urban forest benefits and implementation of the city's urban forest management plan. Okay, that's the objective that the Internal Technical Advisory Committee will. That objective was sent back to the public committee to ensure that it did not conflict with the vision and the goals. Okay, so it comes back. All right, now we've got an element and we've got objectives. You can see the triangle on the right there a little bit, giving you some clues. Then we said, well, okay, so how are we going to judge whether we're achieving this objective or not? And this is what we're calling performance indicators. Are we achieving this objective or not? So what we looked at then was, okay, a series of performance indicators. You know, are we doing a low performance level, a moderate performance level, a good performance level, or are we at optimal? Are we really hitting it right now? Okay, and again, the Internal Technical Advisory Committee works through all this to create these performance indicators. Now, in this case, they also, and then those performance indicators are looked at by the Internal Technical Advisory Committee, and they begin to judge the present state of urban forestry within the government right now. And they indicate that, at least for this one, for this element, that they are at a low level. They are at the lowest level, okay? This is the way we're going to monitor how well the city is doing in implementing its plan. You can see at the bottom, the consensus action, because they come up with a whole plethora of potential actions, and the actions are not intended to move from where they are today all the way to achieving the objective. This is a trap that we get into a lot. We try to go from where we are all the way to the optimal, but this is a conversation. This is an unending effort, conservation. So what we work with them to understand is that they need to create actions for the next 5 years that are likely to help, or maybe even complete the move from low to moderate in this case. Move it one level up, get progress. Have it be that you have a positive outcomes in your urban forestry program. Number one, it's a trap to try to go all the way to optimal. That's a trap. Number two, things are changing all the time, so you don't know that 5 to 10 years from now that objective might change, okay? That's the other thing. And the other thing in terms of your urban forestry programs, and urban forestry, the program in general is that you want to be able to demonstrate that you are making progress. You want to be able to demonstrate to the public that you understood what they said, what they wanted, and that you are moving in the right direction. Michael, you want to say something?
Just want to say really, again, developing these performance indicators. How do you go about doing that? How do you go about thinking that? And I think it's really important. One of the things when we have that objective, I find it's easiest to either pick the optimum. How would you best define? How would you best measure that objective? And to create that optimum, then it's often sort of easiest to say, well, let's talk about what would be low or not desirable. And then sort of thinking about how to move between those steps to moderate, to good, to optimum is important, that those steps sort of have some fluidity between them, and that they're not just sort of these arbitrary steps in between. So I think it's really important as you develop those performance indicators that they do represent sort of measurable criteria that can be actually seen as progressing towards that optimum. And then it's important, once you establish those, as Rob said, is then to say, well, where are we today, and define that. And in this case, they define themselves as being at low. That is often something that people resist a lot, and these the ITACs will resist, sort of say, oh, we're low, because it's perceived as a negative. But the reality is, if you really look at things and state where you are on that set of criteria, you may be at low, and there's nothing wrong with saying you're at low, because this planning process then says, how are we going to move forward? And so, and what steps are we going to take to move us from low to moderate? And that's the initial step, then from moderate to good, et cetera. The other thing that I wanted to mention, Rob, before we move on, is the idea of optimal. And sometimes it's perceived that once you're at optimal, well, you're done. You've achieved that and you don't need to do anything else. And in some cases, at the beginning of the planning process, developing of this plan, your team may determine that they are at optimal for whatever reason. And so they think, well, we don't have to do anything else. No, that's a wrong thought too. You got to figure out, how do you stay at optimal? How do you not move back down that ladder? And so you're going to have to develop action plans to maintain that. And in many cases, you may have gotten it optimal without realizing what you did to get there. And so that's going to take thought to go into thinking about what steps do we need to take to maintain optimal. So I think this is a really incredibly important tool. And so often, like Rob said, people want to move from low to optimal and in one time frame, and that's not at all what we're trying to do here. But this is the way, when I talked about earlier, how evidence, how science, how data can inform and measure these movements. This is where it happens right here.
That's correct, Michael. But performance indicators need to be measurable and quantifiable if you can. You can't always be, but if they can, they need to be. Also, keep in mind what Michael just said about often government agencies don't like to admit that they're at the low end of something. This is where you kind of get into a sticky point sometimes with the different aligned agencies. I can't say it enough. Don't forget these folks. Go back to them. Go back to them when you can. Go back to them as individuals. These are your friends. I know so often I've heard, well, the politics. Trust me, friend, people, these are your friends. If you're dealing and you're having their conversation, they're as much your friends as the arborists, foresters, and conservationists who you see most of the time. Communication is the key. Communicate. Communication means listen. Communication means talk. Communication means sharing stories. But communication leads to the building and the sustaining of trust. And the building and the sustaining of trust leads to honest, open conversations and debate, and the ability to work through critical thinking processes that allow you to identify the true problems that you all are trying to address. And very often, even though it seems very odd to say, many of the same problems that affect the urban forest are the ones that are closely associated with problems that are perceived as social. This then is the implementation form of this type of planning process. Michael and I have designed them in Florida to these plans to have shelf lives of 20 years. And that doesn't mean that after 20 years you throw it out the door, but 20 years because the comprehensive planning cycle for municipal and local governments within the state of Florida, they update their comprehensive plans every 20 years. Comprehensive plans are the foundational law system at the local level. So what we want to do ultimately, and we've been successful 3 times now, in getting these urban forest plans to be completely accepted and embedded into the comprehensive plans, which are the foundational plans for the city. Now, does that mean that everything gets implemented? No, of course not, over time. But what it means is it becomes part of the real infrastructure of the legal system of the city. It's a 20-year plan. Each plan itself spins off into five-year action plans, okay, that deal with the specific actions that address moving those performance indicators 1 notch towards optimal to address the objectives that support the elements that come directly from the goals and from the vision. These 5-year plans then allow departments the opportunity to budget correctly. Budget processes within municipal and local governments are generally over a 2 to 3 year period. If they're going to adjust and do things differently or put new things into their operational plans, they need to be able to get it into the budget cycle ahead of time. Also within this 5-year implementation plan, it then allows the individual departments to adjust annual work plans for employees. This is critical because what Michael and I are suggesting is we're trying to give you an idea of how to embed urban forestry into the government and government operations, not to have it seen as a separate thing. Because Public Works is managing the urban forest by the way it manipulates the landscape, as is all of the other departments. The final piece that we have here that we're going to mention very quickly here at the end is monitoring. How do you monitor the implementation, the timing of this plan? How do you monitor the effectiveness of the individual actions that are being taken? And how and when do you monitor and validate what you've done in the past? So monitoring measures progress or the lack of progress. That's a tough thing to get governments to accept. I want to tell you that I'm very proud of the city of Tampa and the city of Gainesville because they have embraced this. They are going to monitor what they are doing, when they are doing, and how effective it is. And they are going to be able to tell if they're making progress or if they're slipping backwards in some cases. It is very rare that a government has done this. This is a very unusual thing being asked of a government to do. Think about how rarely they go back and look at their policies and their laws to see whether they've got the outcomes that they intended. This type of measuring, this type of monitoring, long-term, enduring programmatic monitoring leads to institutional learning. And institutional learning changes bureaucracies over time. This is a long-term process. You will not be able to get everything that you and I think we need immediately. I want to give you a case in point though. It doesn't have to be terribly onerous. It doesn't have to be terribly expensive. Let's take a look at what we've got in the city of Tampa and also, as it turns out, in Gainesville. They have a no net loss of canopy cover by neighborhood, or that's in Tampa. That's in, that's in Gainesville, and planning district in Tampa. It's not very expensive to do this. A low-tech method which has turned out to be more robust over time in terms of measuring how the canopy is changing, is to actually not use GIS, is to use aerial photography, and then you can use them, put it up on a screen in a computer, and then have a systematically place random dots over the area you're interested in, and then count the dots that have canopy and count the dots that don't. This has actually been proven by us over the last 12 years to give you a more reliable estimate of the canopy over time as you look from one year to the next, to the next, to the next. It's very simple. It's very low tech. You don't even have to have a computer if you want. Michael and I are old enough to remember when we used to do this with aerial photography and acetate copies with dots on it. And this is just an old forester's way of doing it. But it works, and it's proven to be very robust. Adaptive management, uncertainty. There is uncertainty in what we've done. Number one, because we've never done it before. Urban forestry and its management has never happened before at this level of concern. We have a very quickly growing urban population, which is causing uncertainty about how the urban core will densify and develop, how the emerging urban forest will change the forest landscape as it spreads out into these metropolitan regions. And also, right now, we have a great deal of uncertainty being laid on us due to climate change and how that's all going to play out. Uncertainty is the name of the game for us today. We do not have clear-cut answers. Looking at this thing from an ecosystem, from an ecological perspective, we recognize that what we have today is contingent upon the history of the landscape, the contingent upon the history of the people and their values in the past. So these things are changing. We have to have a way to deal with long-term collaboration among many stakeholders over long periods of time. You know, monitoring the city's natural resources is a process very similar to those already addressed and developed in business. So there are models for doing this. Okay, we don't have to make this up. The basic applications have already been developed, and there's little reason to reinvent the processes. What you do, though, is you need, like any form of conservation, it needs to become integrated into the entire system of the municipal regional governments. It has to be unending, and that there is going to be resistance to institutional change, to incorporating urban forestry into the systems and into complex legal environment. These all can be impediments to adaptive management and continuous monitoring, keeping in mind that the continuous monitoring goes back to those performance indicators that's going to provide you feedback over and over again about whether your actions that you've chosen are actually leading to the outcomes that you want. And that adaptive management then is that process of looking at that and saying, okay, well, maybe we need to look at a different form of action to address that particular outcome.
And just to emphasize, it's not the outcomes you want. It's the outcomes that were expressed by the people.
Right. That's right. That's right. Thanks, Michael. And here I want to mention again the permanence of the public committee and the permanence of the internal technical advisory committees. They have to continually perform that process of making sure that the government stays with the values of the people, the vision, and the goals and the guiding principles. And the internal technical advisory committee needs to be continually involved in looking at the monitoring, the information coming out of the monitoring, and whether you are achieving those performance indicators. And they need to do this on an annual basis. And they need to do this where they join that information together, because the public committee is going to continue to drive the social values into the process, and your technical experts are going to continue to drive their technical expertise, which you need to make this a reality, and they are going to continue to merge them together, and they need to annually report back to the city commission, to the political body, so that the conversation never ends, and that once they do it with the political body, they need to have an annual State of the Forest meeting, public meeting, so that the conversation and all of the individuals and all of the institutions that are involved in this conversation recognize that the conversation has not ended and that their input is continually being recognized as being important. Michael.
And again, that's a very critical statement. When we talked about earlier in some of our earlier presentations, we talked about management plans and how often they're just taken and shelved because you deviated from them immediately. And this, by keeping it at the forefront of the conversation, it will not allow that plan to just go away. It stays in front of everybody.
Just one more look at how it's structured and how monitoring plays a role. It's integrated and consistent right from the vision, right down to the work plans of the individuals in the departments, all the way down to the individuals driving out in the truck this morning. Their work goes all the way straight back to the original vision and the goals. This is an integrated system. It is a systems way of thinking about this. It is a way of ensuring that urban forest management plans, programs, whether they are dealt with at a project level, up to a city level, out to a regional level, are integrated and consistent. Finally, I want to say, and we want to say, that urban forest management and conservation, the goal is sustainability. The sustainability of the ecological processes, the lands that produce the resources, the beauty, and all the rest that we as society need to sustain ourselves and to sustain the biological diversity that we participate in and upon which we are all highly dependent. This is Michael and my email address. We shared this with you. We recognize that even over these three parts, we provided a lot. We believe that this is important, what we're talking about. We believe that the forefront and the frontier of forestry is actually urban forestry. And that urban forestry, in the way that we describe it, as forests being directly controlled by the social society and the urban economic drivers that permeate far beyond the city core itself. Michael, do you have anything else to say?
No, I'm curious how.
Go ahead.
I'm just curious how the conversation we're going to have here after following this, and I also want to know how many people agree with me on the direction of the triangle.
The foundation of urban forestry is vision and those goals. It is a social endeavor. Well, thank you all very much. John,
Hang on a
I guess
minute.
finally, while John's unmuting, I did want to say that Michael and I were actually very sincere about the idea of collaborating with other people and consulting with other people and helping. We want to help. We are conservationists. We are managers. We care. And I guess finally, I want to say to everybody who's listening right now, thank you. Thank you for what you do. And more importantly, thank you for caring. There are not enough of us in this world who care and are trying to make this happen.
Okay. Oh God, my muted.
No, you're on, John.
Can you hear me now?
You're
Right.
on.
Sorry, everybody. I'm now talking into my phone and looking on the laptop, but it's all very confusing, and I don't understand these things the best of times anyway. Right. Great. Thank you very much. Goodness. I'm sure at the beginning of this, Rob, you said we're going to talk for about 40 minutes, and it's got longer every week. I've loved it. It's less and less for me to do. It's perfect.
Well, I apologize for the length of this one, but we had to cover it.
You can make it up with another bit of guitar work at the end. So, That was absolutely brilliant. And I think probably most people kind of don't know this, I guess, but really, I think, Rob, it's fair to say this all started, or this lecture series started because while you were giving a previous presentation as a webinar for the Arb Association, talking a little bit about an ecosystem approach, somebody asked, well, how do you do it? And you gave an answer, and then later you said, John, I feel like I didn't really give proper justice to the answer. Can we do a little bit something more about it? And this was sort of born out of that question. And I think you've definitely explained how you do it.
Well, started, and again, Michael and I are more than happy to talk with anybody and help better understand what it is we've done. And we would love to learn more about what's going on in other parts of the world.
Absolutely. Well, the chat has just been great again. It always is. And thank you all so much for watching and for putting your questions in. It's been absolutely fantastic. Okay, we're going to start getting through some questions. I should say we're definitely not going to be able to get through all of them, but we always make all of the questions available afterwards to Rob and Michael, and they'll be able to have a look through them and maybe answer them a bit later. So one question, this might almost take us back to a recap from the first episodes, really, but I think it's worth thinking about this quickly as we reach the end. Question from Ashvani. What makes your approach to urban forestry an ecosystem approach? And what makes this different from other ways of getting at urban forests? What's special about an ecosystem approach?
Okay, I'll take a crack at it, Michael, first.
Yeah, go for it.
It's first off, as we started out earlier, talking about ecosystems and ecological understanding of ecosystems, is that most people today, even in some textbooks within schools, teach that ecosystems are closed, that they're self-regulating, that they can't be manipulated from outside of their boundary, that their boundaries are complete and that they're not permeable, that most of the time the work that's been done on ecosystems has looked at areas very far away from human settlements in the past, and so have focused on what we call old growth forests or virgin forests, and that ecosystems and ecology in the past has deliberately excluded humans as part of an ecosystem. And all of those things are recognized by science today as being just the opposite. That ecological systems are open, that we can define boundaries, but those boundaries are permeable, that they can be affected by outside agents, and particularly important is that human beings are part of the entire system. So that makes it an ecosystem approach right there. The other part is that today we are all beginning to look at models, thanks to Dave Nowak and other people, that recognize the relationships between the urban forest, or forests in general, trees, shrubs, everything, and how it affects other parts of our environment. That's an ecological perspective, and that is what is becoming exciting and associated with urban forestry today. It's an ecosystem. The boundary of your city, just like what Michael and I showed earlier when we showed Tampa and then we showed the watersheds around it, the boundary of that city, that's not fixed. Cars go in and out every day. We commute, we bring things in and out. We all talk about invasive and exotic species. So looking at a city today and looking at the way that it is expanding, and it is expanding socially, economically, and then eventually actually grabbing in bigger chunks of the land physically into the city itself, that is an ecosystem approach. It is a dynamic look at the urban forest, not one that is static, not one that looks at just individual trees, but looks at relationships between people, their environment, and the vegetation and the environment and how it affects people.
Yeah, I would just add to that, you know, is the sustainable nature of this process and the scalability. I mean, you referred to both of those, and I think that's very important in terms of thinking about systems-based science and using science, both the biophysical science and the social science, and getting the participants to recognize that. That to me is what's really important as well, in addition to all those things I just said, Rob.
Great stuff. Thank you. I wonder if I might get an email from you, Rob, next week saying, I don't feel like I answered that properly. Let's do another webinar series. And I was like, yeah, let's do it. Okay. So we've got a couple of questions have come in about the same sort of topic. Sorry, I'm rummaging around to find them because my technology's failed me. Okay, we've got a question from Jan here, or Jan, apologies, I'm never sure. Can we apply silviculture in urban forestry to help some trees grow vigorously and more resistant from pests and diseases and some other anthropogenic activities? So hold that in your mind, because there's another question coming. So to what extent can we apply silvicultural practices to urban forestry? And then I'd like to tie that in, if I may, with a question from Sherwin, which is, what is your expert opinion about using native forest trees, i.e. trees that are usually used for timber, becoming ornamental or urban trees?
Michael, you want to handle the silviculture one first?
Well, sure. I mean, silviculture is simply understanding how trees and forests respond to manipulation, and how those plants respond to manipulation to meet management objectives. And that's how I define it. And so, you know, silviculture, by all means, that is how I'm trained as a silviculturist. And so one of the things how we can begin to use silviculture in urban forestry is to begin to think about not just working at the individual tree level, which is where we may start, but looking at the collection of trees to meet management objectives. And that's where we've been trying to talk about this planning process to create those management objectives so that you can begin to determine what is it you want those trees to do. I think one of the things that I'm sort of interested in exploring from a silvicultural approach is the notion that every tree needs to be planted and expire on its own. Whereas in silviculture, we'll often create a rotation, a cycle for which those trees that may be planted will then move through, and to meet that objective, you may harvest those trees at some point in time. And I think that that's something that we haven't explored well, is sort of the silviculture of urban forestry. The idea that we're going to use these trees to meet some objectives, and that there may be a point in time where they've reached their optimal outputs of that objective for that goal, and then it's time to start over again and to create that management cycle. And that's something that I don't hear many people talk about, but I really think as we can now better measure the outputs and have objectives that are focused on the services or the functions of the trees, we can begin to create management plans that have something that a silviculturalist would recognize, sort of those rotation agents, things like that. So that's something that I'm very, very interested in exploring more and developing more over time.
And Michael, that has been discussed, as you well know, before. And of course, the whole idea of the utilization of the wood, of the trees, as they're harvested in urban areas. And I think this is an area that needs to really be explored because as we all know, our urban areas are becoming metropolitan regions, and they're subsuming whole patches of forest. And so it is possible to even manage forests, patches of forest in these urban regions. A quick example, and then I'll get to the native tree thing, is what Ross Dickerson is doing with the 32,000 hectares of native habitat he has in Hillsborough County. Is one of the things he's doing right now, and I won't give you all the reasons why, but it's all part of restoration, is he's planting large blocks of pine trees, okay, that are commercially valuable. And he recognizes that when he needs to clear them out to do some more restoration, his whole idea is to plant those trees, and then he's going to harvest them. And he's going to sell them for wood products, and he's going to get money back in to support the budget. The same thing could be said for the budget of an urban forestry program. And in fact, up in Wisconsin, there are a couple of cities that are actually doing this right now. Okay, so native trees in urban areas, why not? Why not? And especially why not if you're looking at the fact that your city is in a regional context, and the city needs to begin to think about playing a role in the maintenance of biological diversity and what it can do. Cities can't just be black holes that suck in resources. They have to begin not only being sustainable and being neutral, they need to be able to produce and be productive. Native trees in the United States, by one of my old colleagues, Doug Tallamy, are extremely important in terms of the Lepidoptera that they support, Lepidoptera being moths and butterflies. And they support these moths and butterflies. These moths and butterflies, their pupa, are the primary food that the songbirds use to feed their chicks to get them to fledge. Birds being the main form of wildlife that we enjoy and help us with our health and with that idea of beauty within the city. You don't plant native trees, we've seen what happens. They do not become nativized. It does not happen, okay? Because the relationship between the trees and the Lepidoptera is a co-evolutionary system, and the mouth mechanisms and the digestive tract of the pupa of the Lepidoptera, of the moths and the butterflies, has co-evolved with the leaves of the specific species of trees that they have evolved with. You bring another tree in, doesn't matter whether it even looks like it, it's different, and it just doesn't work. And what you begin to do is you begin to see the pauperization of the native diversity of songbirds within your city and your region.
John, can I ask you to repeat that question? Exactly what they asked about the native?
You can, and then I will have to then find it. Hang on a minute. Right, so Sherwin asked, what is your expert opinion about using native forest trees, e.g. trees that are usually used for timber, as ornamental or urban trees?
Again, my thoughts on that are is that there's no problem using native trees in urban areas if they fit the site, if they're appropriate for those site conditions. And so that's really the important aspect there. In the case of Gainesville, as Rob said during the presentation, when we did the inventory here, the forest that you see, the urban forest you see here in Gainesville, generally reflects the forest that you see in the more wildland areas. And so the plant communities are very recognizable. Now, does every tree work in an urban setting? No. And so there's going to be certain trees that just don't work, whether because the hydrology has changed or whether the confinement of the root space is not available to them. And so it's very important, and that's why we created that urban tree matrix, which I think we shared with you, John, for both Tampa and for Gainesville. And so as you can look at that list, it's full of native species. There's also some non-native species on that list. And but what it does do is it allows you to, in the case of plantings, to determine whether that tree is appropriate for that site. And we certainly know that in the urban matrix, the conditions are completely different in some places. The soils have been removed and replaced with all kinds of fill dirt that may or may not have the same microorganisms and whatnot. And the trees are not going to be able to survive in those situations. So the heat and those moisture regimes are completely different in urban settings. And so you're not going to want to just willy-nilly put those trees there, but the fact that it may be a timber species and you're utilizing it in an urban setting, there's no problem with that.
Over all the webinars we've done, every now and then the issue of native trees gets raised, and when it does, it always opens up a really interesting debate. And we'll probably have to do a full webinar just about native trees. There's been some interesting points in the chat. Mark Bays in Oklahoma. Hi, Mark. Hope you're well, my friends. Mark saying it all depends on the definition of native, which I think is very important. But it was raised in an earlier webinar that in Florida, you've got quite a lot of native species. You've got a lot of diversity there already. it's quite different to in the UK when people talk about just using native trees. We've got a very limited range. And Isabella, oh, just disappeared off my screen, but Isabella has made a very good point, as she so often has in these webinars. In Brazil, there's such an enormous biodiversity of tree species, and it's relatively easy to find those species that tolerate the urban conditions and can serve as ecological stepping stones. And Naomi's made the point in the chat as well, that there's no point using native trees unless they can cope with the urban environment, because they might be native to a country, but if they can't thrive in that completely artificial environment, then it almost doesn't matter in some way. So I don't know if you've got any thoughts on any of that, or we can just move on to the next thing.
Well, John, I think it's a question of choice, and opportunity to have these species. I think if Neville was on right now and we would talk about native species or non-native species, he'd be talking about fungi, right? And different beetles and things like that also have co-evolved with your native species. I mean, we have to be very careful about this conversation because we cannot assume that when we replace a native tree, which is an enormously big biological entity with all kinds of relationships to fungi and bacteria and insects that have co-evolved with it. I mean, we can't that co-evolution. It insists that we put back, that we keep those bits and pieces that these other bits and pieces have co-evolved with. Now, if you're talking about going downtown London, or the woman, I guess maybe it was yesterday when we had the webinar, she talked about Philadelphia with the row houses, and she only had a couple little planters on her street. Well, that's a whole different thing, Then you buy a little tree and you put it in there and you keep it for as long as you can, and you get what you can out of it. But if you have a choice between a native and a non-native tree, and they're going to grow, you should be picking that native tree every time.
Okay, well, I've just written it down on my bit of paper here. Native trees. We're going to do a webinar. Just decided we'll do it in the autumn, and we'll thrash this issue out, and we'll work it out once and for all, because there's some great conversation going on in there on a very different subject. I think Paul wins for today. Paul, good morning from Fiji. Hello, Paul, and thank you very much.
Hey, man.
I don't know what time it is in Fiji, but you win possibly for today. Okay. 2 questions here about funding. One from Shannon asking, how did Tampa get the funding for this process? I think Shannon's from Florida, so what grants do I need to find for my municipality? But then I'd just also like to add Ian's question, which is saying, has the commitment of the government and the departments, has that commitment remained firm when tested by the tougher economic and budget conditions that we've had in recent years?
Michael, I think I'll dig into this one. Huh?
Sure. Yeah, go for it.
Michael and I talked earlier about the Tampa Bay Forest Working Group, which was a collaborative that we put together about 15 years ago to work on urbanizing forests in the Tampa Bay region. Some of the initial partners in that group were Kathy Beck, Stephen Graham, and Sean Landry. And Stephen was the urban forester in Tampa at that point. He was having a great deal of political problems associated with their current policy of replacement and mitigation and things like that. And his stance was that they had to have this whole mitigation process in place for new development, otherwise they would lose the urban canopy. And the economic interests said, no, they didn't believe that. So we were asked to do initially an urban forest canopy assessment by the city council and the mayor, because they wanted to know whether their policies and ordinances were actually functional and doing the job, or whether they were irrelevant. Okay. What came out of that was the beginning of all this. because Stephen Graham called me up and he said, Rob, I know that we can do this urban canopy analysis, but you and Michael told me that we could do an ecological analysis also for not very much more money. And we could learn a whole lot more about our urban forest. That's how it begins in Tampa. And everything that we explained today was all part of how it built up until it became partially sustainable, okay? And that they're continuing to fund it and monitoring. Real quick answer about government agencies and what goes on over time is I can only tell you that when you initiate and you get this conversation going and this collaboration going, you cannot stop, because the momentum of this will roll back some, inevitably, okay? But the city of Tampa is still very much enthused about this and committed to it. We just had a meeting with the director of sustainability, looking at urban forest plantings associated with equity. And we also saw the mayor come out just recently doing public announcements about sustainability and how proud she was of our city having an urban forest management plan. Michael?
I would just say some things that to think about. Certainly, funding for these projects initiated might be opportunistic when you have grant opportunities coming from whatever entities are out there. You got to have your eyes open for them. But one of the things, once we've gotten started with cities, is that they look to their mitigation funds. And so mitigation funds are funds that are available at fines and fees associated with development. And a lot of times those mitigation funds were earmarked for replacement of trees that were lost in the process of development. In many places, these cities will have mitigation funds, and they are designated with this very finite set of parameters by which they can be used to replace trees. One of the things we've done in both cases in Tampa and in Gainesville, we've had this discussion with the bureaucracy, and they've made some headways into changing how those mitigation funds can be used to support the scientific management of these urban forests, to better, enhance the urban forest and to create a sustainable urban forest. And so that's something that you can look at if in your city has a mitigation fund. Look how they've defined how it can be used, and perhaps expand the verbiage there so that it can be used to create a plan like the one that we've described. As far as a commitment and holding firm on that commitment, I'd say in Tampa we've gone through a couple administrations, and I remember when we had the first change in mayor from when we started to the next one. That was we weren't sure whether this was all going to go away. And we were concerned about that, but it didn't, and it doesn't, because again, the inclusivity, the fact that we brought so many people into this and that they're part of it. And so I think that's lends itself to the staying power of these kinds of plans.
Yeah, Michael, that's a good point. I mean, you've been through three different administrations in the city of Tampa. It's not gone away. It's in the comprehensive plan. Okay, so the comprehensive plan doesn't ensure, just like all laws, who drives down the road and follows the speed limit all the time. Don't need to raise your hand, because there won't be many of us, but it's there. And so it can be used, and it's legitimized, okay? The other thing is what Michael talked about the mitigation funds, and this is going to continue to move on as we urbanize the metropolitan regions, okay? Number one is, we talked about this yesterday, and we mentioned this, Isabel raised a question. We need to start looking at retaining patches of our forest. Trees grow better in groups, not individuals. We need to recognize that reality. Okay? This is not mitigating forests by doing landscaping. Okay? That's not the same. Nothing wrong with landscaping, but that's not mitigation of forests. The other thing is that mitigation funds in Tampa are specifically geared towards restoring the canopy in these different planning districts. So it's very much tailored in that way. And John, you might remember the first time I did a presentation for the AA was in Exeter. And my presentation was on an ecological approach to the mitigation of the loss of canopy in the urban core, individual trees. The city of Tampa now does not require the replacement of an individual tree for an individual tree. It says you measure the canopy of the tree you're taking out, and in 5 years, that canopy has to be back in the city of Tampa. That's the difference. That's also an indication of the embracement of the city to an ecosystem approach to urban forestry.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. I've got a question. Can I misuse my position to ask a question? I was going to tie it into a question someone else has asked, but well, okay, I will do that. We've had a question from Rahul, who's asked many, many good questions over the last few webinars. So thank you very much. You're a frequent contributor. Rahul's question is, can these models be replicated in the developing world where government intervention is minimum and communities are not very aware? And I'd like to expand that with my own question, which is that you talk about the administrations changing and the different mayors and everything, and it sort of strikes me that all of the work you're doing is almost dependent on being in a democratic state, in a state where the politicians are required to listen to the people to a greater or lesser extent. What could people do if they were in a system where politicians didn't really care what people thought, if they didn't have to win their vote, for example?
And that's an excellent question, and one that Michael and I have discussed.
We talked about
as we did this webinar. And my immediate answer, and of course I do live in a democratic country, so you forgive me if I misrepresent something a little bit, but all political power in the end rests in the hands of the people. Even the dictator cannot stay in power if in fact the people decide that he can't stay. And I think we're seeing that played out in Minsk right now, where people are just saying, hey, that's it, you can't stay. You can't stay. Now, I hope that all works out. Of course, that has nothing to do with violence and everything else that can happen. But I think essentially still, it is the greater social value that drives things. It's easier where I live. It's not always as easy, okay? Keep in mind, though, that we have mentioned this idea of this comprehensive plan before, that this comprehensive plan, in our case, informs what the mayor and the city commission can do. So we have actually worked at embedding it in the fundamental law that is actually above them all, that actually informs them what they can do. So Michael always said to me, he said, I always get this from Michael. I think I only told him one thing, but he told me, he said, the one thing I learned from you, because I used to work for the office of the governor and all kinds of stuff in other places, was that when you start, you go right to the top. You don't mess with anybody in between. You climb as high as you can into the hierarchy, and hopefully you get to the very top, and that's where you start a project like this to begin a new program that can be sustainably integrated into the government agencies. And we continue to do that. So what I say to other people in developing countries, to answer that, the first question really is that will this process work? Yes, we think it will. I believe it will. What'll happen is your outcomes will be different. But you will begin to build this integration of social and biophysical together. You will begin to build a better understanding of the relationship between their people and their landscape. It'll work. Just like with Gainesville, you saw how different Gainesville and Tampa's visions were? They're only 100 miles apart. But if you did it someplace else, you would expect it to be very different, but it would still function. You might identify different objectives and goals. Maybe education becomes the thing that has to happen. Well, then you've learned something, and now you have science to show to people that who you might influence who can help you achieve that. Michael?
I just want to add, yes, I did learn that from Rob, so go to the top. But I would like to really point out is that what we're presenting here is a process, is an approach, is a framework, is a method, whatever you want to call it. But it's not a silver bullet. It's not the answer to everything. It's not everything's going to work perfectly. And the other thing I think that to keep in mind is that it takes time. And nobody wants to hear that. Nobody wants to hear that this is not something that's going to happen in a year. It's not something that's going to happen, you know, and even maybe 2 years. It's going to take you a while. And then once you start it, as Rob has said, it's a non-ending process. But it takes time to build and communicate and build those collaborations. So, you know, going into this, don't think you're going to be able to just, if you're starting from scratch and you don't have all those connections, that's going to be where you start, and be prepared to invest in it and build those relationships.
Very interesting. Thank you very much, both. Okay, we've been going for 2 hours. It has just flown by, and I think we better wind it up with just a couple of questions. I'd like to possibly finish with a question from my very good friend Paul Mandabondabo from Papua. Hi, Paul. Again, it's ridiculously early in the morning for you, so thank you so much. Paul's making the observation that the issue of climate change is high on the agenda of every country these days. Will the species of trees for the city and in the index be changed, looking to accommodate the different leaf area index and everything for climate issues? Are you changing your approach because of climate change?
Yeah, the short answer is yes, of course. As a matter of fact, in Tampa, we have, along with one of our colleagues, Andreu, have begun to look at how minor shifts in climate over time will affect the species of trees that are likely to be most appropriate in the urban core. But really, this is why we emphasize the use of adaptive management and monitoring, because it's through adaptive management and monitoring that we're going to notice change over time. There does not seem to be a predictive model exactly for how climate will change at an individual site or location. So what we have to do is to really pay attention. There's going to be no silver bullet for that or no magic model for that. It's up to us to pay attention. And it might actually wind up being us that winds up noticing changes in plants and phenology, and the trees that make it and don't make it, or the changes in the insects that feed on them, or the diseases that occur, that actually begin to inform the climatologists about the impacts and the changes in climate within our specific areas that we work in.
You know, those impacts are going to vary from place to place. In some places you may see increased rainfalls, in other places you may see decreased rainfall. In places coastal, you know, in particular, I think about Florida, we're going to see a lot of, you know, potentially sea level rise, and that's going to have impacts. Down in Tampa area, thinking about sea level rise, how that's going to change mangroves and their distributions, and where are they going to migrate to, and so those kinds of questions are really big questions that, again, need to be based on an understanding of where the trees are, how abundant they are, and what kind of, you know, what's the existing context by which they grow in. And then laying another layer of information about that predictions of what are the future impacts going to be. This is all only going to be possible, though, if you have a good, sound understanding of that biophysical landscape. And by doing that, then you can begin to understand and model some of those impacts, and that will then inform, you know, what kind of trees, where those trees are going to go, and what kind of trees need to be placed in these different areas. But these are really good questions, and again, without having that baseline information and the change information, that monitoring information over time, which rarely people want to do, we will not be able to really address those kinds of questions well, effectively.
That's right. We won't be able to answer them. I want to quickly answer, really quickly, John, a couple of questions. And it's the same answer. One of the things that we have done, and we talked about this the first time, is that the collaborative that exists within the Tampa Bay watershed is a collaboration of scientists, governments, scientists, and managers. The scientists, that's a whole different conversation about how you bring scientists into your project and into your city to help you understand how to do these things. But also, scientists bring in research money, and they also help with that part, the budget part of getting this information together. That's a whole nother conversation.
Okay, well, there's lots of questions remain unanswered, I'm afraid, but I think we're going to have to leave it there. This has been absolutely brilliant. What it's all been building up to, we must have had a good 5 or 6 hours now of these webinars, and it's all been building up to this moment, Michael. Guess that cone. People are staying on purely for this. We've had a couple of guesses. Reveal all.
Let's see here. I saw somebody in the chat got it pretty early on. So here's the cone. Not quite as big as some of those other ones, but one of our larger ones locally. So I went afar the last 2 times. This time we've got a longleaf pine or Pinus palustris cone. So and I saw somebody spotted that. So one of my favorite trees.
I can say it was Martin who spotted it, and kudos to Martin, who was also either first or second to spot the cone last week. So Martin, you need to get a hobby or something.
I'm impressed.
Okay, well, look, Rob, Michael, that was just brilliant, all of it. Thank you so much. It's just been amazing. It's been an absolute pleasure to be a part of. There's always, as always, a lot of love going on in the chat. I wish I could, Rob, there's a lot of rumor on the street, has it, that you played us out on the guitar yesterday. I don't know if there's any truth to that rumor.
No, it didn't happen.
No, okay, fine. That didn't happen. I tried though. So hopefully, I put the link to the next webinar in 2 weeks' time in the chat, because I'm shamelessly plugging myself. Hopefully see you there in a couple of weeks. Check out the website for all the information and other webinars and all the other stuff we've been doing. Stay safe. Look after yourselves. Thank you all so much for everything. It's just really exciting to be a part of this, and we will see you very soon. Thank you very much, everybody.
Stay safe, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Great experience.